Have you. I'm Eric Stokin, Director of the Center for Social Science Scholarship. We at CS3 are very glad to be hosting this talk with my colleague, Dr. Felipe Filomeno, Associate Professor in the Department of Political Science and Director of the Global Studies Program at UMBC, and former Associate Director for CS3. We want to begin by acknowledging the Drescher Center for the Humanities, which co-sponsored this event, which includes being entered into a drawing for Dr. Filomeno's new book, Christian Cosmopolitanism, Faith Communities Talk Immigration. At the end of this program, we will raffle off 5 copies of the book to some lucky winners. We'll also be providing copies to those of you who registered and are members of the clergy or members of the Latino Racial Justice Circle. We thank you for being here virtually this evening. Before I introduce Dr. Filomeno, I wanted to note a few upcoming events that might appeal to you. On March 26th at noon in Fine Arts Room 011, we'll co-host an event on research in perilous times with the Drescher Center and the Department of English. This will be a 2-part event focused on conducting research in this present context. On March 26th at 4 p.m. in the Library Gallery, we'll have a Grand Challenges event focused on sustainability, which will feature a set of lightning talks by faculty and practitioners on the topic of sustainability. Finally, on March 27th at 5 p.m. in the Library Gallery, Dr. John Schumacher, as part of our Social Sciences Forum, will present his Lipitz lecture on AI and higher education. You can find details on these events and much more at socialscience.umbc.edu. CS3 is also on LinkedIn, Blue Sky, and other social media sites at UMBC, SOC, And be sure to follow our UMBC group where we post center news and events. We also have our very own CS3 podcast, Retrieving the Social Sciences, which features scholarly engagement on Spotify, Apple, and Amazon Music. So thank you once again for being here tonight. Please allow me to now introduce Dr. Felipe Filomeno. Dr. Filomeno is a higher education leader experienced in academic affairs, global education, campus community engagement, deliberative dialogues, and research capacity development. He is an associate professor of political science and global studies at UMBC. He holds a PhD in sociology from Johns Hopkins University, where he was a Fulbright scholar. His research investigates human development in the context of Latin America and the Latin American diaspora in the United States. He is the author of Christian Cosmopolitan, Faith Communities Talk Immigration, which we'll hear about tonight, Theories of Local Immigration Policy, and Monsanto and Intellectual Property in South America. We will now turn it over to Dr. Filomeno to present on his book, and then we'll have a Q&A period that will follow. With that, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Stokin, and thank you also to Amy Barnes, CS3 Program Coordinator, who, as you all know, takes care of the logistics of these events. And I apologize for the technology issues here. I know that it will seem that I'm not looking at you, but in my mind, I'm looking at you. At least you get a better view of this beautiful Peruvian tapestry that I have here in the back of my room. All right, so this book is about religion and immigration. I think these are 2 very light, non-controversial topics that I decided to write about. And I'm glad to see so many people here who are interested in hearing what I have to say about it. I see some students, my UMBC professor friends and staff. I think I even have some neighbors and friends from church here. So that's great mix of people. So back to religion and immigration. I decided to write on these 2 very easy topics. And on top of being 2 contentious issues, and that reminds me of, when I was young growing up in Brazil, every Saturday or Sunday, we would get together, my grandparents, to have lunch with the extended family. So you can imagine this big table, it's an Italian Brazilian family. So everyone is, being loud, talking with their hands, talking over each other. And now and then someone would bring up politics or religion. And one of my grand aunts would always intervene and say, no politics or religion at the table. And I clearly didn't listen to her advice, because here I am talking about religion and a very political topic, immigration. And on top of that, I decided to investigate these two topics, their relationship, using a community-based research approach, which meant that I had to be in close collaboration with faith communities in Baltimore in this case, collaborating with their lay members, their clergy members. And as a gay scholar, you can imagine how much anxiety that probably gave me, considering how now welcoming to LGBTQ people some faith communities have been. Thankfully, in this project that turned out to be a problem in only one case, and I can talk about that later in the Q&A if you so wish. So back to how this project originated. In 2017, I started to volunteer with a group called the Latino Racial Justice Circle. This was back then a faith-based group of volunteers. Now they are a nonprofit organization that I still volunteer with. And the LRJC, that's how I'm going to call them from now on. First, when I found them on Facebook, on social media, I was like, oh, Latino Racial Justice Circle, that sounds like a very interesting group. I was just curious about these, all these words together. So I show up to one of their meetings, and they started and finished every meeting with a prayer. It was originally a faith-based group, mostly folks from different Catholic congregations in the Baltimore area. And I remember in one of the first meetings, one of the prayer handouts that we received, it was a prayer that included praying for multicultural families, praying for immigrants and refugees, praying for LGBTQ people. And I was like, wow, this is a certain kind of Christianity here, right? Quite different from, what we see on the news, the intersection of right-wing conservative politics with Christianity, what today we call Christian nationalism. What I found there was actually Christian cosmopolitanism. So this constellation of religious beliefs, ideas, practices, and institutions grounded in the Christian faith that try to build the kingdom of God on earth across boundaries of religion, race, nationality, ethnicity, language, culture, and so on. So this idea of the kingdom of God as the cosmopolis where everyone belongs, this universal community. And the LRJC had a sister organization called the Racial Justice Circle. And the Racial Justice Circle was a group that was founded to address issues of racism that African Americans had experienced in Catholic communities that belonged to the Baltimore Archdiocese. And it was a quite successful program. So the LRJC wanted to create a program that was about immigration and Latinos in the church. So we got together, and I designed that and I led that program as a community-based research program. So intersecting my community service with my research interests. And in the process of designing this program, I did research on what already existed in the country. And it turns out that many organizations across the country, some secular, some religious, have used dialogue to promote mutual understanding and collaboration between immigrants and people born here, also to help people discern how to act, how to approach immigration. And many of those organizations are religious. There was, when I did my research, there was a significant growth in the number and the frequency of dialogue events in faith communities about immigration around the year of 2016. You can imagine why. And so inspired by this work that has been happening across the country, this dialogue tradition, we designed here for our Baltimore context, a program consisting of 3 weeks of dialogue, 1 meeting per week. In the first session, people will talk about their personal stories about immigration and their feelings about immigration, both positive and negative. Right? So we had specific questions in the dialogue guide about tensions on immigration. So discomfort that some people feel about the presence of undocumented immigrants in our country. Or the perception that immigrants take jobs or compete with US-born people for not only for jobs, but also for housing, for welfare. So all these perceptions or misperceptions, but anyway, not just the positive opinions on immigration, but also things that ideas that are built around these tensions between groups that immigration can bring to communities, or they can emerge because of immigration. So that's the first session. In the second week, the participants talk about similarities and differences between immigrants and people who are born in the United States. And in the third session, they think about the future. So they come up with a vision for excellent intergroup relations in their communities, for how immigrants and non-immigrants are getting along. And they decide on one collaborative project that they would undertake in their communities after the dialogue to bring their communities closer to that vision, that ideal vision for the future. So we designed this program, and between 2019 and 2022, we implemented that program 7 times, so 7 dialogues, each with 3 weeks. Members of 14 congregations participated, congregations, all Christians, but from different denominations across Baltimore, urban, suburban. And on total, around 100 people participated in those dialogues. With the help of my UMBC students who worked as research assistants, we recorded every dialogue session, transcribed word by word what everyone said, and then analyzed the conversations, not only to understand the substance of what people were saying, but also to investigate how they were talking to each other, right? So the process of dialogue, not just the substance. I'm going to share with you a few of the findings that were more striking to me, and that, you know, in the book, there is, of course, a much more expanded version of that. First, we found no evidence of systematic domination of these dialogues by any particular group. We looked specifically to whether clergy people that were participating, if they were going to dominate the conversations or not, and whether people who were born here, the non-immigrants, would be also taking more space in the conversation than the immigrants. And that turned out not to be the case. There was no evidence of systematic domination on the part of any of those groups. And when we went deeper into the substance of what people were saying, looking at, you know, the statements of immigrant participants and the statements of non-immigrant participants, we found that immigrants, when they were talking, they were usually giving perspective. So sharing to other people about how they see the world, the challenges, the opportunities that they face in the United States, what led them to move here, you know, how their life is. And US-born participants, a lot of times they were taking perspective, and they took much more perspective than they gave, meaning they were trying to express empathy, they were asking questions to immigrants, and they were trying to put themselves in their shoes, right? And to me, the combination of, on one hand, no group is dominating the conversation systematically. We have US-born participants taking more perspective than giving. There's more room for immigrants to give perspective. To me, that signals an equitable conversation, right? And then looking back, the explanation that I give for that is based on the theory of intergroup dialogue. And it's an explanation based on the model of dialogue that we adopted. It's a model that I call diversal, bringing together diversity and the universal, right? So it's the idea of a dialogue that tries to integrate unity and diversity without privileging anyone. It is tempting in the practice of dialogue in communities, and especially in situations of conflict, to focus just on what people have in common, their shared interests, their commonalities, their common goals, their shared spaces. And it turns out, research has shown that that type of dialogue tends to marginalize the voices of people who are already marginalized, right? Because you're talking only about the beautiful things that everyone has in common, and you don't have space for people who are from historically marginalized groups to express their grievances, to talk about their challenges, to discuss inequality. And of course, we didn't want that. So we created a dialogue model that, yes, people talk about their similarities, they discuss common interests and come up with a collaborative plan at the end of the third session. But we also head on talk about inequality, differences, diversity, tensions that people experience in their communities that are associated with immigration. I'm going to do two examples of how this diversality, right, diversity and universality appeared, surfaced in some of the dialogues. One is one of the main findings of the book is the black-brown solidarity that emerged in the dialogues. So basically, Latinos and African American participants bonding over their experiences of shared marginality in the United States. So that's something I've observed in several of the dialogues. And in one dialoguing participant, there was this moment, this exchange started by an African American participant, a woman. She said something like, well, when I go to an immigrant neighborhood and I enter a store, a shop, I try to buy something, and they're talking to me, if it's a Latino neighborhood, they're talking to me in Spanish, even though they can tell that I'm American, and I cannot, I don't understand why that's the case. It's a place of business. Shouldn't they speak in English with me? Why do they keep speaking Spanish? So she expressed discomfort with that. And in response, several of the Latino participants explained to her, why is it that happens? That in those ethnic enclaves, you have a persistence of immigrant languages, and why immigrants, of different nationalities keep speaking in their homeland language. And the exchange continued, and in the following session, I think she was, she had time to reflect, this African American woman, and then she started, going back to something that we had discussed in the previous session. I realized that both Latinos and African Americans, we're both discriminated on the basis of language. Us African Americans, we don't speak the King's English, and we are discriminated because of our accents. Latino people, I realized hearing from them that they face similar situations. So that was, a very interesting moment where we moved from a tension over linguistic differences to a solidarity on the basis of language, right? So this diversality at play. Another example of that integration of diversity and unity was an awareness that a lot of the US-born participants expressed of the privilege that comes with just having been born in the United States. Something that it's not earned, right? You don't have to work to be born in the United States, you just are, right? So that's a privilege. And that emerged usually in the second session when we had two questions about similarities and differences. So one question was, why do you think that immigrants move to the United States? And if you were born here, why is it that you moved to Maryland? Or why is it that your ancestors moved to here? And then the other question was, what are the problems that immigrants face in the United States? And what are the problems that US-born people face in the United States? So different participants shared and connected over their similarities or differences. And in many instances, it was a humbling experience for the US-born participants to listen to the immigrants, because then they realized, yes, all of us here, for instance, care about our children. We care about our education. We want our children to have better economic opportunities in the future. We want good schools. Yes. But then when they hear from the immigrant parents, they hear from the undocumented parent who takes the kid to the same school, but is afraid of, now dropping the kid off and picking the kid up from school. Or there is the parent that goes to talk to the school counselor or the teacher, and then it's the little child that is bilingual that has to do the translation, the interpretation for both. Or that immigrant parents have to deal not only with those challenges and educate their children, but also with the fact that their children are growing up in a culture that is different from theirs, and all the intergenerational conflict that can come with that, right? So imagine they were talking this about education, and then there were the healthcare versions of this. Then there were the workplace versions of this. And so it was a very humbling experience, and it led to US-born participants to see, yeah, we're all human beings. We all care for our families. We're all one good health. But then, when it comes to the day-by-day of life, they were humbled by the challenges that immigrants face and that immigrant participants were sharing. And they couldn't come up with something that, was equivalent to that, right? So they became aware of their privilege. So again, another example of similarity and difference, unity and diversity getting combined in interesting ways. You can learn more about that in the book and other findings. So now I'm going to jump to the limitations, right? Because it's not like this type of program, even though there was mutual understanding and collaboration that emerged because of those dialogues, because of that civic experiment, right? There are also limitations that I found in this type of work. First, looking at the conversations, there was not much disagreement between people. And on one hand, that can be a good thing because it's a sign of mutual understanding. And the goal of dialogue is to generate mutual understanding. People are understanding each other, sharing understanding about whatever is being discussed. And most instances of agreement that I found in the conversations, they were not just people saying, yes, ma'am, right? Or just, simply agreeing, with someone else without actually giving thought to it. People were actually elaborating on arguments, corroborating each other's points through storytelling, right? So it was not just a blind, disagreement, or something that, didn't involve much critical thinking. People were thinking critically even when agreeing with each other. However, too much agreement can be a problem. It can be a sign that maybe some people are self-censoring, right? Maybe some people are here in the front of this priest pastor and they don't want to share something very controversial about that they think about immigration. Or maybe there's not enough ideological diversity in the dialogue. And that turned out to be the case to an extent. Most participants self-identified either as liberal or moderates. It was a smaller portion that self-identified as conservative or conservative-leaning. We also did not have many evangelical congregations participating, only 2 out of the 14. And we know that evangelicals across Christian denominations, evangelicals tend to be more conservative than the average Christian, right? So that pointed to me to a limitation in terms of the type of congregation and the type of people that this program tends to attract, right? So that's one limitation. And I can, for every of these limitations that I mentioned, I'm happy to discuss them further in the Q&A, including how we might overcome them, right, to an extent. The second limitation that I found that was significant was that not much of the collaboration that emerged between participants after the dialogues was sustained or deep. Sometimes they were. There are cases, congregations that participated in the same dialogues, because sometimes I would pair 2 congregations together, or 3 even. Some of the dialogues happened within only one congregation. But, quite often I brought 2 congregations together, and some of these pairs of congregations, they are still collaborating today. They still have joint prayer services. There are some relationships between their congregants that have stayed and, are still alive. So that's great, right? Sustained, deep, meaningful collaboration. But in other cases, in one case, for instance, we had only a multicultural potluck, which was one single time event, right? And we know how ethnic food can be fetishized, right? A lot of people may love Mexican food, but don't love Mexicans. So I was, I'm not letting you get away just with, having a multicultural potluck. So I created a trivia game about immigration with some good questions about the realities of undocumented immigrants in the United States. But my point here is that these dialogues, you hope that they will plant a seed for a future relationship and collaboration. But in some cases, that will happen. In other cases, it will not. Also, all of the collaborative projects that emerged in this program over those 2 years were either religious or cultural in nature. They were not civic or political. And that is despite the fact that throughout the dialogues, people talked about the politics of immigration politics, immigration policy, all the, challenging political issues around immigration, they were discussed. And still, at the end, no one was choosing to, okay, our collaborative project will be for us to get together and write letters to elected officials asking for an immigration reform, right? No, there was no, the projects were all mostly around culture and religious services within the congregations, not really interacting with the, let's say, the public sphere and civic life on immigration. So those are two limitations. I'm happy to discuss that further. In terms of next steps, so the book was published, but the ministry continues. I'm currently facilitating a book club in my own church here in Towson, Trinity Episcopal Church. We are discussing a book called The Ungrateful Refugee, and I designed the program with our rector, and it's a program for people to not only build community within the church, but also to learn about immigration and refugees and discern how to approach this issue individually and as a community in a way that is aligned with their faith later, right? So again, a process of conversation for action. I'm not using the guide that I used for the conversations in the book, but I'm generally open to any type of conversation for action on immigration, and that's why I stay open to facilitating those. Now we are at almost 30 minutes, and before we open to the Q&A, I just want to express my gratitude, because I know that some of those folks are here, to the people who've had the courage of welcoming a stranger into their faith community to facilitate our conversation about a topic that is highly political, that has biblical significance, and that is also very, very personal for some people, including for me. Thank you, and I'll be happy to take your questions.
Great. Well, let me just start by saying thank you to Felipe, and as he noted, to the guests that are here tonight. So we'll open it up to Q&A. I'll just sort of take the lead on the first one. And I have had an opportunity to engage with the book, and I actually want to read a passage with the recognition that no research is easy, right? A lot of research is hard, but just to kind of signal how effortful this kind of engagement is. So on page 118, you write, and I'll quote here: "At the beginning of every dialogue, I told participants I would not act as the arbiter of who was right or wrong on specific issues. Many times I heard them saying something about immigration, and I knew was inaccurate or that I disagreed with, but I stayed silent." And I just want to call attention to how challenging that must be. But I also wanted to kind of use it to frame a question about this kind of balance that exists between this engagement is something that could be beneficial, and recognizing that there's a lot of community engaged scholars or future scholars who might be interested in kind of understanding how do you grapple with this tension that might exist between goals that might align with your community interests and goals that are part of the scientific endeavor, right? And sort of how do you balance those two perspectives as you engage in this kind of very meaningful work? So I figured I'd start you with the easy question.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Sure. Easy question. No, but I appreciate the question, and I'm sure at UMBC, we have an effort for community engagement, to do community engaged research, and it is it is a special kind of research, right? You become a member of the community. And in my case, it was not just that, oh, sometimes someone would say something about immigration that I disagree with, and I'm not able to intervene in that moment. I'm not supposed to correct the person because I told them that I was not going to do that, and I don't want to break the trust. But this is a program that I developed with people that eventually became friends with me in the LRJC, and I also wanted to keep myself in check, meaning that, please tell me that if I'm wrong, right? I have to find ways to keep myself in check. And so, for instance, when I was coding the data, I created one code for things that are falling out of the expectations, right? So, signals that the program was not achieving its goal, was going in the wrong direction, right? So that I could be explicitly looking for things that could falsify my hypothesis, right? And I also did what we call in community-based research participant checking, right? So at the end of the program, at the end of the project, when I had almost finished the book, I wanted to refine the findings. So I had a focus group with the leaders of those faith communities. I invited all the clergy, to participate in this focus group, and I sent to them, I share with them, like, these are my findings. Like, does this resonate with your experience? Do you feel differently about it? Is that how you experience that moment that happened in your congregation? Does this resonate with you? So that was, a way for me, when you are doing community-based research, you are immersed in the community and you're able to see things from within. And that's great. That gives you a vantage point that other scholars might not have, depending on the method they use. But there's also a downside that if you become a member of the community, you might develop some other kinds of blind spots. So I had to rely on people to correct me and be very systematic in the data analysis, very intentional about looking at evidence that that didn't fit what I had expected for the program. Also, when analyzing the data and looking at the substance of people's arguments, something that when I studied critical discourse analysis, I read someone giving advice, read, give more attention to the, to discourse that you disagree with, and because we tend to, elevate, confirmation bias. We tend to elevate the things that we agree with. So you have to have, I think critical self-reflection, it's important in every research process, but perhaps even more important in community-based research. And that critical self-reflection, sometimes it's about restraint. I had Tanya Lizarazo, I don't think she's here, but she helped me with we had the first two dialogues that I facilitated. She created digital stories with some of the participants, right? And for that, she had to be present in those dialogues and taking notes. And I remember in one of those sessions, some people had said some really, weird things about immigration. And at the end, we were walking out, and then she looked at me and said, like, I don't know how you do it. I don't know how you do it. How you can listen to those things and not say anything. But as a facilitator, the best I can do, in those, as a minimalist facilitator in those cases, the best that I could do is, okay, does anyone feel differently about it? Or is there any other perspective on this issue that we are missing? Would anyone like to share a different experience about this topic? And hope that the people, that other participants would take on that, right? But not interject and correct, right? In the very session, someone said that, I don't know what immigrants are coming here for. They come here, and they have all those, many of them coming from Latin America have solid Catholic values, and they arrive here and they think that this is Sodom and Gomorrah. And I was like, oh my gosh, what am I going to do with this now? But those were the moments in which I had to exercise self-restraint. Yeah.
Great. Well, thank you for sharing. And others, I hope, feel free to, raise your hand or, of course, type in the chat. So definitely want to open it up to others' questions.
I think
Yeah,
Brian
might not see our hand up.
Yeah.
Yeah. So thanks, Felipe. I love this stuff. As you know, the department loves this. We all, I mean, it's great. The fact that you got into the community, the combination of doing research and community engagement is awesome. I'm curious when you were talking about the limitations in terms of the evangelicals, you said you had two groups who are evangelicals, made me wonder more generally, if this was sort of how you recruited groups and people into these, and whether you went off and looked for them, or it was sort of like, you advertise this. Obviously, if evangelicals, like 8 and 10 of them vote for Trump, then it's and Trump has the policies that he has towards immigrants. It'd be really interesting to dig a little deeper into that side, and I'm sure you've thought about that. But I'm also just curious whether those evangelical groups that you had were substantively different than the other groups, or whether it was just a mishmash, and that could be based on who's going in, right?
Right. So I try to recruit people in different ways to recruit congregations, right? So there were first you recruit the congregation, and then you work with the congregation to recruit the actual participants of the dialogue. And I use my social networks, especially through the Latino racial justice circles. They belong to different faith communities, and then like snowballed based on that. But I also made some cold calls, and like went around Facebook, and around town. If I see a church, I make write the name down, and I try to find the email of the pastor, and I send emails to everyone. So I because I did part of the goal of the project was to identify one of the lines of variation could be denomination, right? So maybe a dialogue like this in an evangelical congregation will be quite different from the same dialogue in a Catholic congregation, right? I was not able to find much of that variation according to denomination. I did find more variations across race and ethnicity and immigration status, whether you're an immigrant or not. So that made a difference. In liberal conservative as well, but non-denominational, and perhaps because of the small number of evangelical congregations. One of those was a Latino congregation, but I should say a Latino evangelical congregation that is probably exceptional, because Latino evangelical congregations can be very conservative and sometimes even anti-immigrant, sometimes insensitive to their undocumented congregants. But that was not the case of this congregation, so they were a bit unusual. And then the other congregation was predominantly, but more typically evangelical, predominantly white, conservative, suburban, blue collar. Yeah, but I did try to, throw a wide net to recruit as many different as possible.
And I'm trying to see if anyone else has their hands up, but it's I'm only seeing a couple tabs per. So if you do, maybe just jump in at this point.
I have a question. Can you hear me?
Great. Okay. Mm-hmm.
Hi, Felipe. This is Kate from
Hi, Kate.
LRJC. I was just thinking while you were talking, because I've been sorry, I'm like multitasking, so I'm walking, I'm out of breath. But I've been giving my husband a really hard time recently, because he likes to go on social media and see people he disagree with and get in these like social media fights with them. And I'm always like, that's not how you change minds.
Mm-hmm.
I'm just wondering, like, listening to you, do you think that like the only way for people to really come around and change their opinion about things is to have that interpersonal connection and that time to develop a relationship? Or are there ways to have these kind of conversations when you don't have that opportunity?
Yeah, so that's a great question, right? And I was hoping that we would be able to talk about this. So there were shifts in opinion when in exchanges like the one that I mentioned about the African American woman who used to feel discomfort when going into an immigrant-owned business, and they are not speaking English, right? And how that person later thought differently. So there were more cases of that. Of course, it's a 3-week program, and it was never the intention of the program that people will go like from conservative to liberal or liberal to conservative as part of the process. But I was able to observe some shift. Now, a dialogue is not a debate, right? And I think, going on social media to debate with people who think differently from us, I tried doing that as well. I don't do that anymore, or at least not as much, because yes, it's not very productive. And the very format of social media, how it is structured, is not conducive to dialogue, right? It's just people debating, trying to prove each other wrong. And I think dialogue is more productive when dialogue is possible, right? So if I start talking to someone about immigration and they reply to me saying that I have to go back to my country or something like that, then dialogue is not even possible in the first place, right? But if you feel like it is possible, then you can try to engage in actual dialogue. And I think that here is one of those wonderful moments when Christianity and science converge, right? Because a lot of Christian principles for conversations and dialogue match what the psychology of intergroup relations and the psychology of communication has found to be productive. I'll expand on that. And here's some Christian advice on how to have conversations about immigration in a dialogical way. A lot of Christianity is about decentering the self, right? So we are not the centers of the world. God is, and God in others, right? So it's about decentering the self and centering the other person. Humility and is a core principle of Christianity, at least in terms of the teachings of Jesus, right? The Sermon on the Mount is an example of inverting, our culture, right? So blessed are the meek, blessed are the peacemakers, right? And I think humility and restraint go a long way in conversations. And the paradoxical idea of Christianity, that it is in giving that you receive, right? If you approach a conversation, a disagreement, someone expresses an opinion about immigration that you disagree with, and you approach with the goal of just changing their minds and proving them wrong, that will not go well. That will put them in defensive, and it will perhaps backfire, right? The person will actually, feel threatened and get defensive and really even more consolidate even more their position. But there is a way to listen and to speak with humility that can help you build trust and eventually make room for the person possibly shifting their opinion. In terms of how you listen, how you listen, how you receive information. First, that should be the first thing you do, to listen, not to speak, not to try to contradict. Ask the person to elaborate their thoughts and listen to understand, especially listen to understand where they're coming from, what are the underlying values or concerns that the person has, right? So if someone tells me that, I have no problems with immigrants, but the fact that we have so much illegal immigration is something that bothers me. Okay, so that suggests to me a problem that the person values the rule of law. That's where the concern is coming from. So listen to understand rather than listening to respond. Ask probing questions. Those are all signs that you are making space for the other person. So it is in giving that you receive. So give first, give your attention. So that's about how you receive information, how you listen. There's also humility about how you speak. First, try to identify the strong points in what the person is saying or points of agreement. We all have blind spots, maybe there's nothing in what the other person is saying that can be saved, but if there's something there that can be saved, that is a strong point, recognize that, right? Practice moral reframing, which means make an argument, not just with your values and your moral perspective in mind, but with the value of the other person. So if it is someone that tells me that I can realize that they have a rule of law concern with immigration, that that's where they're coming from, I can say, yes, I agree that the rule of law is important. We also have laws that give rights to immigrants. We also have asylum law, right? So maybe we should just expand this idea of the rule of law to also include the rights that immigrants have, and then we can have a broader discussion, right? Because I do value the rule of law just like you do, right? Or perhaps we can talk about, are there any aspects of U.S. law, U.S. immigration law that you think we should change, to make the law make more sense for our economy, for instance? And then maybe we can discuss and maybe reach agreement on maybe, temporary work visas, and things like that, right? some possible areas of compromise across the aisle. So identify strong points, make agreements from their moral perspective rather than yours, right? Just like, for instance, if we were talking about climate change, right? And I encounter an evangelical person, and I want to convince them that climate change is something that is real, it's important, we should do something about it. And I start throwing on them all this, scientific data about climate change. That will not work, right? It's not what they care about. But if I tell them, like, look, the environment is God's creation. We should care for God's creation. I don't think God is happy with everything that we're doing to the environment. Maybe that's something that will create a space for you to have a conversation about that. So the same thing with immigration, right? So identify strong points, identify areas of agreement, try to morally reframe your perspective, hedge your statements. Meaning, if someone says, oh, undocumented immigrants don't pay taxes, you could say, actually, they do. According to the IRS and the Social Security, that is hundreds of millions of dollars that undocumented immigrants pay this way or another. Well, that will not fly well, right? You can say, actually, I know an immigrant who is undocumented, but they own a business and they pay taxes that way, right? Or, from my understanding, or based on what I read, or in my experience, I think that probably, so you're hedging your statements instead of presenting your opinion as an absolute abstract truth, right? And one way of doing that is through storytelling, right? So you share a story, you share an experience of yours, rather than saying an abstract argument, and the person who receives that will not feel judged. Well, this is not an argument that I have to counter. This is someone's story, right? But of course, you're conveying a point. You're making a point with that story, but it comes in a softer way than than an abstract logical argument based on data, right? So both in how you listen and how you speak, you can can establish a dialogical pattern of communication. And research shows that conversation across differences work better when you practice that. It can seem counterintuitive, because if someone says, something bigoted about race or immigration, the last thing you think you want to do is, make more room for that person to elaborate on their points, right? And that's the paradox, right? It is in giving that you receive. Sometimes by giving them space, asking questions, you can build some rapport that can later lead to a shifting of mind, or complicate how the person thinks about things. Now, again, go ahead.
Oh, sorry, Felipe. Sorry. So we have about 10 minutes left. We got three more questions. So once you're done, I'll ask the next couple.
No, let's go to the next. Yeah.
Okay. So rapid fire round we're entering now. So we got one question about what faith communities were represented. We got one about the what might have been the role of social desirability in your sample if it had been more politically diverse. And then finally about UMBC students as research assistants, and and hearing a little bit more about the kind of training, support, and outcome students receive. So figured I'd throw them all to you at once, but happy to re-articulate those.
I see three questions there, so I'm going to try to answer the three of them within the 10 minutes we have. So in terms of faith communities, they were all Christian, but we had Catholic, we had Methodist, we had Lutheran, evangelical. I think those were the four denominations that we had. Then what might have been the role of social desirability? Well, in those, like in any focus, even on a one-on-one interview, you have social desirability, right? People don't want to say bigoted, or they might self-censor. Even data that is, what you think is very objective, like income. We know that people lie about their incomes, like people don't want to seem like too rich or too poor. And if it had been more politically diverse, so that's something that I talked about with the faith leaders after the congregation, after the whole dialogue project was done for the purpose of the book. And I asked, well, so what do you think if we because in one of the congregations, the pastor actively invited. He knew the people in his congregation that needed, he in his mind needed to have that conversation, people that lean conservative, and he handpicked them like, hey, please come to this program, and we had very, very interesting conversations as a result. However, most of the faith leaders were not okay with that. They thought that, this, you should come when you're ready, you should, if you're already inclined to, if you're ready to have this kind of conversation. Some pastors were concerned, well, I would worry about the safety of my undocumented contents, and the type of discourse and speech that they might be exposed to if we, actively invite conservative people to come over. Also, there were, a Latina pastor one day told in this focus group she shared, us immigrants, sometimes we don't know how much white people can handle, of what we can talk about and what we can share. And yes, like in one of the meetings, for instance, one of the dialogues, this young woman was talking about the challenges that she faced during the crossing the border, including abuse and getting sick. And, I looked to my right side and this white woman is crying, and I thought, okay, good, you're crying, I guess, it moved you, but it's that kind of concern that this pastor had also, like how much white people handle. So we call the program Honest Conversations on Immigration, but the honest is aspirational, right? Because we are in a social context there and people are, modulating what they're saying. Bambi, about the UMBCS research assistants, how the kind of training, support, and outcomes. So in terms of support for the students, they were all paid. We had grants to support the students, thankfully. And the outcomes, the training, I trained all of them on transcription, that they did a lot of the transcription. And then I did most of the qualitative analysis, but they did some of the quantitative content analysis, right? To basically verifying if clergy or non-immigrants took too much space in the conversations. And the outcomes, the students were great in keeping me in check, I remember after one of the dialogues, one of the students that was there, he told me Professor Filomeno, I think you let those two white men talk too much in this conversation, and, you should have made more room for the women to speak. And I was like, yes. And I became very attentive to that, in the future, in the other ones, or, there was this one dialogue with mostly older African Americans and Latinos at a church. And, it's a lot of Catholics that came out of Vatican II, so social justice Catholics, and they were talking about civil rights movement. And then I was driving my students home, the campus, and then they were discussing how oh, we think that we are so progressive on the environment and on social issues, and they were working on these things decades ago, so there was, it was a moment for intergenerational learning for them as well. So I think that was one outcome for them as well, not just, being experienced in the research itself, but being in contact with those communities and learning from them.
Great. Let's see if there's any more questions. Oh, and these are the winners of the book. So thank you for joining us today. Felipe, I'll ask you one more question, unless I see anyone else. But I know in the book you make reference to one local clergy member who was sort of resistant to bringing this to their congregation to actually have this sort of dialogue. And I was wondering if you could speak to sort of the resistance of that, but also then, what you find kind of engaging in this dialogue, which seems that, to some extent it does increase maybe, better understanding and tolerance of other members. So could you talk about this sort of initial resistance that some may have felt in actually engaging in the dialogue to begin with?
Yes, people are afraid of, talking, about difficult issues, and people prefer just not talk about it. And in this case, it was a church that was basically bicultural church. They have the English mass, they have the Spanish mass, basically two communities sharing the same building and the same God, but they don't have really intercultural relations. So I went there to try to, you know, build those relationships. And the priest in this case was afraid of that talking about these things would actually bring division, when actually the experience has been the opposite, right? Like we never had, you know, a falling out between people as a result of these dialogues. And actually the falling out ended up tragically happening in that congregation, which actually turned out to be one of the congregations that was in the downsizing program of the Baltimore Archdiocese. They're closing several, merging several parishes. That was one of the parishes that ended up, you know, being merged with one another, and they don't seem to be doing very well. And I was like, well, you know, maybe if one thing that I learned is the congregation, for an advice for congregations is create shared spaces, have clergy with intercultural competence that can navigate those relationships, create a language policy, and, you know, make sure that your longstanding congregants acknowledge the privilege that they have over the congregation, the power they have, and are willing to make room for the newcomers.
Great. Well, thank you very much. Any other burning questions? I know we have about 2 minutes remaining. I'll certainly just take a little bit of this time to again thank you, Dr. Filomeno, for being here today and presenting on your book. Again, we'll be in touch for those that want, but definitely take a you know, quick read through this book, Christian Cosmopolitanism. So very glad to have you here today. So thank you.
Everyone, appreciate you all being here.
Thanks, Felipe.
Thank you, Felipe.
Thanks. Take care.
Bye.